welcome to Synod Assembly, and we're going to get started. I'm just going to begin our assembly with a brief presentation. So grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. And we begin with a reading from Luke's Gospel from the Peterson translation, The Message. That same day, two of them were walking to a village in Emmaus, about 7 miles out of Jerusalem. They were in deep conversation, going over all the things that had happened. And in the middle of their talk and questions, Jesus came up and walked along with them. But they were not able to recognize who he was. And he asked, "What is this that you're discussing so intently as you walk along?" They just stood there, long-faced, like they had lost their best friend. And then one of them, his name was Cleopas, said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what's happened during the last few days?" And he said, "What has happened?" And they said, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene. He was a man of God, a prophet, dynamic in work and word, blessed by both God and all the people. Then our high priests and leaders betrayed him and got him sentenced to death and crucified him. And we had our hopes up that he was the one about to deliver Israel. And now it's the 3rd day since it happened. But now some of our women have completely confused us. Early this morning, they were at the tomb and couldn't find his body. They came back with a story that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of our friends went off to the tomb to check and found it empty, just as the women said, but they didn't see Jesus." Then he said to them, "So thick-headed and slow-hearted, why can't you simply believe all the prophets said? Don't you see that these things had to happen? That the Messiah had to suffer and only then enter his glory?" And he started at the beginning with the books of Moses and went through all the prophets, pointing out everything in the scriptures that referred to him. And they came to the edge of the village where they were headed, and he acted as if he were going on, but they pressed him. "Stay and have supper with us. It is nearly evening. The day is done." So he went with them. And here's what happened. He sat down at the table with them, and taking the bread, he blessed and broke it and gave it to them. At that moment, open-eyed, wide-eyed, they recognized him. And then he disappeared. Back and forth, they talked. "Didn't we feel like we were on fire as he conversed with us on the road, as he opened up the scriptures for us?" They didn't waste a minute. They were up and on their way back to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their friends gathered together, talking away. "It's really happened. The master has been raised up. Simon saw him." Then the two went over everything that had happened on the road and how they recognized him when he broke the bread. Here ends the reading. Our assembly theme is Journey with Jesus. And this story is a story of journeying with Jesus. And there is such richness in this story. The part I particularly love is the disciples who knew Jesus well did not recognize his presence. Later, they realize in the blessing and the breaking of the bread, that same action that he did in feeding the 5,000 and in the Last Supper with the disciples. Jesus walked with them on their journey, but they did not perceive him. I think as people of faith, we can remember those kinds of times in our own lives when we were journeying with Jesus, but not perceiving. At times, there could be stress or even trauma in our lives, and we wondered where Jesus was. And yet, later, we realized that Jesus was right there with us. We, as a church, as a synod, each of us and our congregations are on a journey that is shaping our faith and the future of our life together as the church. And I do love this metaphor of journey because it creates particular images for us. One of the things about journeys that is most important in a journey is the journey itself rather than the destination. The disciples were on their way to Emmaus, but that's not the significant part of the story. It's the journey. We often speak about changes that are occurring in the church. Pastor Chris Sear on Edification Day in May talked about changes in the church. And he talked about that the church is not the church of the 50s and 60s, nor will it ever be. He shared stories back from 1850 and 1904, where the newspapers lamented the people that were drifting away from church as attendance in churches dropped. You see, we have been on this journey before, and the 1950s and the 1960s were an anomaly, an unusual time in the church that will not be repeated. So often when I visit churches and congregations on a Sunday morning, they'll ask what the church of the future looks like. And they're often nostalgic for the church, generally nostalgic for the time when they were a young person in the church. And as someone once said, nostalgia is the file that removes the rough edges from the good old days. Because the truth is, the good old days weren't necessarily so good for everyone. And we're not going back, but we are journeying forward. We do not know, nor can we know, the exact destination that we're headed. But the joy is in the journey, exploring new possibilities. As we heard from Pastor Priscilla Paris Austin on Edification Day, stories in her life of encountering Jesus in new and different and in innovative ways to be the church. Pastor Priscilla talked about encountering the living Christ when not expecting it, in working with people with special needs, opening the church to a community in new ways. I was recently reunited with people from a ministry that we began at St. John Lutheran Church in Littlestown. The ministry was called the Miracle Workers. It was a group of Special Olympians who helped develop a ministry in my time in Littlestown. That group was recently together leading worship at St. James in Gettysburg, and I had the opportunity to be present with them. These are people with whom I had the joy of expanding faith. I presided at their weddings, and here it was 10 years later to see their leadership in the church and to be warmly welcomed by them. Amanda Baer, one of these folks, in her message to the congregation said, "We are not people with special needs. We are people with special abilities." A journey that we began together has continued throughout the years with the presence of Jesus walking beside them, learning to walk with Jesus even when they and I was not fully aware of Christ's presence. Journeys change us. It's one of the joys and learnings that I've had as bishop. In my trip to Tanzania, opened my eyes to how the gospel is changing the lives of people, seeing the growth in the church. I remember when one of the deans in the conferences that I was meeting at said, "Bishop, we are a small diocese and just 80 congregations, but we're starting 10 new congregations this year. How many new congregations are you starting?" He wasn't trying to put me on the spot. He simply could not imagine a church that was not opening new congregations. It said so much about where their focus was as a church and how we have so much to learn from our siblings in the Southern hemispheres, where the church is exploding with growth. In Tanzania, they only have 18% of the population that we have in the United States, and yet they have twice as many Lutherans there. It is the nature of journeys to change who we are and the way we see the world. Our global companions change us when we have the opportunity to walk with them. One of the other joys of journeying is the companions with which we walk. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus were sharing their experiences from Jerusalem. We too have the joy of companionship on our journeys together. We're part of congregations, but also as a synod, we have one another, that we're walking together, that we can learn and cooperate with one another on our journey. It's one of the hallmarks of being the synod is our cooperation together. Whether it's in congregational redevelopment groups and cohorts, working together to find new ways to do ministry, or whether it's in youth ministry with our confirmation camps or youth ministry events, or ways in which our congregations are sharing resources. And we work together to feed the hungry, whether it's at food pantries or shared ministries, including food packing events. The list of ways that we walk together is endless. And the joy of the gospel is the relationships that we develop with those around us. And when you think about your faith journey, don't you think about the people who had an influence on you at your time in development of faith? Whether that was your parents or a pastor or a deacon or a teacher, all of these kind of people shape us in our faith journey. And we've been acutely aware of the importance of relationships in the last 2 years and our strong desire to be back together in worship. These relationships were suddenly disrupted by the pandemic. And in that, we realized the importance of the relationships. In breaking bread, in being in relationship, we realized how much it is that we need one another. And I have been so grateful over the last several months to be back together in the congregations. And I long for us to be back together in Synod Assembly, as opposed to be standing here in front of this camera. We do not journey alone. The other things that journeys demonstrate is that we need to be able to travel light. You see, we don't ever set out on a journey and pack our entire house into a suitcase and take all of our possessions with us. I was speaking this week with Pastor Martini, and she reminded me about people who hike the length of the Appalachian Trail. And they start out with a backpack, and they have something for every eventuality, every kind of weather, every kind of situation. And by the first day on the trail, They are jettisoning as much as they can because they realize they can't possibly walk all the way from Georgia to Maine carrying all that stuff. As we journey with Jesus, we need to think about what it is that we will take along and what will weigh us down. There are treasures in our Lutheran heritage that define who we are as followers of Christ, such as our clear confessional documents. But as we pack for our journey, we need to consider what is at the core of who we are and what we've been carrying along that is not needed for the mission to which God is calling us now. The last delight for me in journeying is that we experience unexpected hospitality. How often when we are on the road, we are helped by someone unexpectedly, surprised by hospitality of a stranger. My trips throughout the world have always proven to be opportunities to experience hospitality. Last year in Bethlehem, Bishop Azar of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land invited Connie and I to feast at his home when he heard we were in the country, and it was a magnificent meal. Throughout the Holy Land, Palestinian Christians offered incredible hospitality every step of the journey where we walked, where Jesus walked. As we move forward as a church, we must be open to the gifts and treasures that God will provide through the grace of others. Partnerships with other organizations and churches in our community, ecumenical partners, will strengthen us on our journey. Partnerships such as those that our congregations have with New Hope Ministry in working to feed people, or the Charles Bruce Foundation and the work that we are doing with them on homelessness, are examples of how reaching beyond the walls of our church will help us to find new resources and companions to reach out into the community. The journey we are on as a church, a journey of faith, will be a time to experience the joy of Christ's presence if we do not worry about the destination, but enjoy the journey and allow this time to open us to be changed and to recognize the importance of the companions that we will have along the way, to travel lightly and not be burdened by things that are not essential, and to realize that we will experience the unexpected gifts of hospitality and grace. That's what it means to journey with Jesus. And through it all, we know that Christ is with us, even when we do not perceive Jesus' presence. In our journey as a synod, we know that we feed others as we have been fed by Christ, that we as a church know that this church is Christ's church, and there is a place for all here. Now, in the past year, the offices of our synod, in conjunction with the mission committee and the synod council and the staff, have worked to shape our mission around 6 key priorities. The first is developing leaders, working to find ways to grow leaders in our church, particularly in the first third of their lives, working with our young people in our camps, in youth ministry programs, and then certainly working with people who feel called to ministry, our seminarians. Through our candidacy committee, we journey and walk with our candidates, preparing them for vocation in the church. And we also work to find continuing education experiences for our rostered leaders and our lay leaders, And we continue to work to bring leaders to our congregations through the call process. In addition, we work on fostering spiritual wellness, and it has been a challenging time in the last 2 years for all of us. This pandemic has been a difficult time, and so we turn to our faith for strength and for hope. So we've offered respite retreats for rostered leaders. We've had cohort grants for groups of clergy to gather together, and we have emphasized Bible study and soul care to really strengthen the spirit of our synod. We also have stressed interacting authentically, really living into who we say we are as we go out into the community, reaching out and welcoming beyond our congregations, starting new missions, finding new ways to reach out. And tomorrow we'll get to see some video of some of our congregations and the ways that they are present in our communities. We also strive to care for our congregations. And this is where our ministry happens, on the ground in our congregations. And it is about the relationships that we have in our congregations that really strengthen the spirit of our church. When I went to Edification Day this month, I went to the forum that Charlie Roberts did on youth ministry. And he talked about 3 key things that are important to do with youth, but I think they're important in all of our relationships. He said it is really important for youth to be seen, that they are recognized in the congregation, that we realize they are there, that we call on them for their gifts. He said the second was a really simple thing, to know their names. Each person's name is a gift to them. And when you know their name, it has real power to build relationship. And finally, to know people well enough to know what's going on in their lives, the lives of our young people and the lives of people in our congregations. We work together as a synod to strengthen all of these ways that we relate together in congregations. And it includes the call processes, coaching, mission development, stewardship, and generosity. All of these are ways that we work together to nurture and strengthen and care for our congregations. We're also working to grow our justice outreach ministries. A core to our understanding of who we are as a synod is that we developed a welcome statement in 2016, welcoming all to our church. And so we're using a group of task force to address issues that really isolate people in our society so that they know they are welcome in our church. And we're dealing with task force around hunger and poverty, racial justice, people who are differently abled, the LGBTQIA, caring for immigrants, and the homeless. All of these people need our advocacy, that they receive justice and treatment in our society and a welcome in our churches. And finally, we are working to build global relationships. We have had a long-standing relationship with the Kandy Diocese in Tanzania. It has been a great interchange between us and sharing in ways. And in addition, in the last several years, we have called Jennifer and David Hope Tringali as missionaries for this synod to work in Guatemala. And a number of our congregations have connected with them and traveled to Guatemala and to help and with Tree for Hope, a school for girls that would otherwise not be educated in that environment. It is teaching us about our Southern partners and a better understanding of why people would want to immigrate and risk their lives to come north to this country. And this is an opportunity for us to really grow and understand those relationships. The mission of the Synod is centered on those priorities. And this is Christ's church, and there is a place for each of us in Christ's church. And we are on a surprising and wonderful journey together. And we are graced that Jesus is walking with us. Thanks be to God.